Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're gonna get started here in just a second. If you want to put your name and what state you're from in the chat box, we'd love to know who you're representing. My glasses look crooked, so I'm trying to fix them there. So welcome, everyone. We have Kim Stezala with us today. As a lot of you know, she is our scholarship consultant for KCOA. And we charge her with keeping us abreast of all things pertaining to scholarship and financial aid and all the things that we should know. And so she has put together a program of things that you should be aware of and paying attention to. There have been some changes and all of that. Hello, Doug from Maine. Oh, we got Danielle. Welcome, Danielle, in Louisiana. Kathy from PA. It's been our day, hasn't it, Kathy? You're already sick of me already. Terry from Washington, great. Not yet, anyway. So I think Kim, if you're ready, I think we'll just go ahead and get started. If you guys have questions as we go along, or I think most of you know who I am. I'm Barbara Milligan. I'm the Director of Membership and Engagement for KCOA. So I think I've met most of you, although not all. So happy to have you here, and just type your questions as you go into the chat box, and I'll be keeping track of those. Amber and I will track those for Kim and try to get everything answered. If not as we go, then at the end of the session. And I'm going to turn it over now to Kim.
Hey, thank you, Barbara and Amber. During part of the session, I'll actually ask for discussion, but because we're webinar format, that literally means, typing comments or advice for other states into the chat function. And because I can't see that, again, I'll rely on Barbara and Amber to help feed that information to me. So if you're at the right place at the right time, you're signed up for Kids Chance Give Back Better webinar. This one is on fortifying your scholarship program for the future. So I've been working with Kids Chance, I think about 4 years, maybe 5 years now, on just continuous improvement and looking at what can happen at the state level based on best practices that I'm able to pull in nationally based on having that national view of all these different programs I work with. So we're gonna start off actually with a little refresher, just to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page about the basics, and not knowing again if the Council of State Organization, if each of your groups, if you normally attend these, if you're a volunteer, if it's a different board member attending this time. So that's why we're going to go through the refreshers. Changes to the free application for federal student aid, which the verbiage on that is probably going to affect every state in terms of what you're asking for students or how you explain it. I've been working with the Kids Chance Governance and Ethics Committee in looking at risk management for Kids Chance at the national level. So we'll be sharing some of that information with you today that states can adopt or adapt some of the language there. Talking about your personal involvement with scholarship recipients and looking at some boundaries about interaction with the scholarship recipients, and then really looking at COVID-19 and what the continuing impacts are. So the purpose of today's session is really to help you think about your state, your organization, and what you want the future of scholarships to look like for your state. And this is, many of you have probably seen this, you're perfectly designed to get the results you're getting. And so this is just a little comic from when someone was asked to please build a tree house. And you can see the different ways that people, 5 different ways they built it. And then in the end, what the user wanted was actually a tree swing like this one. So a refresher on cost of attendance. COA is a figure that's based on eligible college expenses, and it's defined by the federal government, but each university or college has to publicly list what their cost of attendance is. We have been encouraging states to move beyond only tuition scholarships and include or allow students to use the money for room and board, books, transportation, any other miscellaneous legit expense that it takes to go to college. And you don't need to figure all of those out per se, because your financial aid is being combined with other sources of financial aid and being applied to the student account. And as you would guess, the university is going to make sure they get paid first. So whatever money comes in, they're paying tuition first. If the student's living on campus, then they might pay room and board, and then the remainder would go to students for other legit college expenses. So that's what cost of attendance is. The financial aid cycle, for those of you who only have one deadline and you're gathering applicants and distributing those funds for a traditional student who's starting in the fall, this is the financial aid cycle that you would probably use. Due to the pandemic, I know students are making all kinds of choices we may not have been prepared for, like starting in the summer or starting in January. The thing to remember about financial aid is it is a dynamic, not a static process. And I think sometimes, like when I've been working with the states, they can get frustrated at, the student told us they had these grants and now they have more grants, or they had loans in their package. Now they don't have loans in their package. I mean, students are just trying to figure out how to pay for college, and it always doesn't, that financial aid process doesn't always happen this neatly on time in the way that we would like it, especially if they're deciding between different colleges and what package each college is offering. So this is, again, just a refresher on the general timeline, but usually if it's even a moderately competitive school, they need to tell the school by May 1st if they're attending that school or not. And if not, the school can then release those financial aid funds to a different student. So just a question we pose is, does your eligibility criteria, your application design, and that review process, does it really serve your purpose? What we mean by that is many of you may be new to the organization. Maybe you inherited policies or practices that don't seem relevant to you anymore, or maybe could use an update. So that's all we're asking you to do here is just really think about what your goals are and how you're structured. This is primarily a need-based scholarship, and how you determine need is usually some kind of combination of family income level or number of dependents. For those of you that do ask students to use the free application for federal student aid, I'm going to share some changes that have come up, but really unmet need means that total cost of attendance minus whatever we used to call the expected family contribution, minus other aid they're getting. And in the end, that's the unmet need. Not all of the states figure out their scholarships in this way. Some scholarship providers will just have a flat amount. Every student gets $4,000 or $5,000, that's it. And you're not really packaging it down to that last dollar. That's fine. Scholarships, we know, help fill the gap. And there's pros and cons to having a flat amount versus a variable amount that changes for each student. Also related to your goals, merit. Primarily this is not a merit-based scholarship, meaning most states have pretty moderate guidelines about what GPA a student might have to have. I don't see class rank as much, especially with a lot of online schooling or new charter schools or small schools or schools within a school. And class rank is just used less in the scholarship industry because if you have a graduating class of 10 and you're in the top 1 or 2, well, that's the top 28%, or you're ranked second out of a class of only 10 versus someone who's ranked second out of a class of 400. Most of you do ask some kind of short essay or short answer to an essay question. And then lately, definitely during the pandemic and due to the pandemic, you know, a lot of the competitive colleges are making it test optional. So if you're asking for SAT or ACT scores, you know, you might need to be a little flexible on that, or again, make it optional, because some students, knowing that their colleges weren't even requiring it, either chose not to take the test, or it wasn't offered at their school because of the pandemic. Service and volunteering, we've talked a little bit about this in terms of your goals, planning for the future. I've encouraged Kids Chance states to look at less emphasis on service work and volunteering, only because these are really vulnerable students. They, you know, may have had a parent pass away, they're down to one parent, maybe they have to work instead of volunteering. So I know that people think it's nice, it shows that people give back, but I would not overemphasize it in your application or selection process. Okay, if we get to the meat of this about the financial aid, I do have, you can pick up this information a lot of different places. I'm providing you a resource at Forbes.com where they talk about all kinds of financial aid, student loans, and the FAFSA changes. So these changes are all good news and good practice for students. So we've been working a really long time to streamline the FAFSA. Just a variety of advocacy groups around the country. And this year it is a shorter application, down to only 36 questions compared to 80. You used to have to use an IRS tax retrieval and matching tool that would pull in your income tax information. Now, when a student you know, goes in or puts their social security number or their parents, that is all streamlined and automatically imported. The biggest change that's going to affect Kids Chance is in your marketing materials, your application, your selection materials. EFC is no longer called EFC, it's called the Student Aid Index. So anywhere in your materials where you're asking a student for their student aid report, which is SAR, the new figure you're going to be looking for is SAI. I don't think there is, for your current students, this is going to be important because they're used to that phrase EFC. For new students, they never knew EFC existed, so they're probably just going to know the phrase Student Aid Index. Big alert, the SAI can be negative now. So what some advocacy groups were doing is saying, if 0 is the expected family contribution, there are some students, and I would imagine, especially among Kids Chance students, where it's less than 0. And I know that doesn't really make sense, but again, it's just an index to try and indicate a student's level of need. And what this does is really, really point out those students who have no money, none to contribute, such that, again, if they go to school, they're no longer working, they're no longer able, or they're not sending money back home or supporting their family. And therefore the contribution would be considered almost negative. Pell Grant is expanded. This is only based on household size and income. It is no longer based on the EFC, which means about 500,000 more students are going to be eligible. We've often said we don't, you know, I don't think Kids Chance of America National expects everybody to be an expert on financial aid, but you are a scholarship provider and you should be at least familiar with this most basic information. So on the left-hand side, what I'm suggesting, if you are trying to fortify your program for the future, looking at the next round of scholarships, definitely do a communications audit of your website, printed materials, letters, any renewal or verification forms. And you might want to say, you know, the new SAI, which was expected family contribution, just to help people through the transition. You might also want to explain or define these terms. And if your selection criteria was such that, you know, students who had a 0 through $5,000 EFC get a certain scholarship amount, you might have to accommodate that to reflect students who now have a negative student aid index. So I know that's a lot of information to take in. I'm gonna just kind of pause a minute, ask Amber or Barbara if there's any questions or comments in the chat so far.
There aren't any questions so far, Kim.
Okay, thank you. So if we look at more FAFSA changes, what the federal government has done is realize that the pandemic has exacerbated the unemployment situation, either with people, their jobs don't exist anymore, or they're trying to get a different kind of job, or they were underemployed, whatever the situation is. The federal government has declared that the rise in unemployment plus the national emergency or the pandemic is now allowing more universities to exercise what's called professional judgment. In the past, financial aid officers would use their professional judgment very judiciously, because they basically can get audited, and if they find that they're making too many exceptions to the rules, the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Post-Secondary Education doesn't like that. And so you often, if you were advocating on behalf of the student, and I actually just did this last week in terms of a student who has no parents, living with her sister, has very little income, wants to go back to school, but the parent died recently, like within, I think 3 years ago, and they just didn't have the paperwork that they needed. So they're able to build a case, if you will, and talk to the financial aid officers about using professional judgment, because when you add up the numbers, it looks like the student's quote unquote not that needy, but in reality, the student really is. So what this does is it allows those financial aid officers a little bit more leeway, and it means that more students can be eligible for the Pell Grant. And I think the questions are something like, have you been unemployed at all in the time, the last 2 years? And so they're working together with students to kind of help get them access to more funding. This is a big change. So the federal direct subsidized loans are now available until degree completion. That used to be capped at 6 years. So students would essentially time out of their program if they couldn't finish in those 6 years. They could not use those direct subsidized loans anymore. Again, I don't know why, but this ancient concept of being able to graduate in exactly 4 years doesn't seem to be the reality as much anymore, unless colleges and universities specifically design a program, that way, with a student taking 12, 15 credits, whatever it is. This is another huge win for families. So this year, schools can ask to verify your identity and your high school completion, but the colleges cannot ask to verify your income or family size. This is a huge win for students because it tended to be the lowest income students or the neediest students that were being targeted for income verification. And that's not my opinion. There's proof out there to say that was happening. So I think during the pandemic, this is a great, again, just kind of a relief for students to be a little more flexible. October 1 is when financial aid opened up for next fall of the 2022 school year. So let's just pause here and ask.
I had one question come in.
I see that. Are we suggesting if the SAI is not negative, that changes our opinion? I guess what I would say is any student that has an EFC, I'm just going to throw it out there. Like any student has an EFC of like less than $3,000 or 0 is a needy student. And Pell eligibility is tied, used to be tied to EFC. Therefore, the students with the lowest EFC were getting the highest Pell amounts, and then it phases out over time. So I don't know that I'm suggesting that you should treat the negative SAI differently or anything above a 0 per se differently. I think what we need to do, especially this year, is just wait and see and look. You might not have any students that have a negative SAI. So I think that just looking at your rubrics, and I love this phrase, you know, like modifications or exemptions or whatever you want to call it, you know, may be issued at the discretion of the board. And so maybe for this year, people are just a little more flexible in those cutoff points. Does that answer your question, or did you want to ask a follow-up question? But that's how I interpret that. Okay. Moving on, then we're looking at risk management, and where this is housed is a combined governance and ethics committee at Kids Chance of America National. So we've already worked on a conflict of interest statement and a whistleblower policy. And on top of that, we're also looking at a code of conduct. The reason for this is, as a national organization, I mean, these are good policies to have. I think some of them are required. I can't remember, Barbara, but I think Vicki said that when the organization submits some tax form, it's 990 or whatever, that you have to say you have these different, the first 2 items. The code of conduct has come about really because just situations in different states where, you know, there's, well, your scholarship recipients are adults, but adults older than your students, you know, interacting with students. And it has just come to our attention that sometimes that behavior might be considered inappropriate. And so we were asked to come up with sort of these guidelines for people. So a conflict of interest statement, you might be very familiar with if you've served on a different nonprofit board. It's just a conflict of interest saying, you know, your duties are to the organization. And for instance, you shouldn't, like, you know, be getting kickbacks or something, or if you donate to Kids Chance in your state, you then shouldn't be considered like as a vendor for the organization or something. So there's really just basic kind of conflict of interest policies. The whistleblower, most of the whistleblower language we found out there was employer based, because your board members are all volunteers. We looked at adapting that a little bit to make it reflect the nature of how Kids Chance organizations are structured. And then, like I said, code of conduct, we do not recommend like giving cash out to students. That can imply a lot of different things. Code of conduct for volunteers. If you've ever volunteered with minors, you might understand that a little bit more, that there's certain things you should or shouldn't do when you are interacting with young people. So we'll pause a minute here. I'm curious if there's any discussion about this. What would be interesting, you know, if there's 10, 12 people, is if people want to drop in the chat, you know, do you have these kind of policies already? Would you be eager to look at these kinds of policies? Have you ever had a conflict of interest or whistleblower situation or code of conduct? So I will wait a minute there and ask Barbara and Amber, and I'm going to put earbuds in because my dog is barking in the back.
All right, can you hear me? All right, does anybody have any questions about the policies, or are you using the policies already? I think the code of conduct policy for me is really piques my interest because it sounds like it could be important for a lot of our states. So Idaho says they do have a conflict of interest statement, but would be interested in seeing others. The conflict of interest statement, whistleblower policy, and some others are required by the IRS. So when you fill out your 990, you have to check the box to show that you have that. So if you don't have it, we'll have a sample for you to use. Mm-hmm. Vicki says Montana has a conflict of interest statement also. But it doesn't sound like too many people have whistleblower policies. And frankly, I don't think we had one at Kids Chance either. So we'll be implementing that. And no code of conducts from anyone. Okay, so mostly conflict of interest people have, but the other two they do not. So it sounds like these are good things to be letting people know about and make them available.
Okay, great. Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so again, just things to think about, and we'll have samples. The Governance and Ethics Committee will have samples available. So student interaction, I think there was somebody in the chat who just said, oh, Douglas, yeah, that you don't really have much interaction with students, and you might not need that. So the question here is, do you have code of conduct policies? Do you have guidelines? Are you transparent about it? So here's some of the things that have just come up, I'd say over the last few years in casual conversation with various members in Kids Chance. So the first is that line between appropriate versus inappropriate behavior could also be appropriate versus inappropriate attention. And what might those boundaries be? We have states all the way from, board members and students interact via text. And we have others where it's very strict. It's only through mail or email. And it's not saying that anyone is better or not. It's just having guidelines about those boundaries. Another one that's come up is consumption of alcohol. I know lots of the states hold galas or like golf outings. And so this would just be about, do you have any policies about consumption of alcohol around minors? Because if you have a college freshman, sophomore, likely they're minors, or I'm sorry, they're not of drinking age. And what that looks like, and are there, again, boundaries around that? The rule of three is one that is used on a lot of college campuses, but mostly you've probably heard or seen this more like at a Boys and Girls Club or some entity where staff is interacting with students. And we call it the rule of three. What it means is you are never alone in a room with a student by yourself. And I really follow this because just all of the years, all of the speaking gigs I've done in places I'm going, I always make sure to meet students out in the open. So a coffee shop, wherever it is, where there's always other people around. Do you have any policies about giving students rides to and from events? Again, not saying it's right or wrong, but if it puts somebody in jeopardy or puts a volunteer even in jeopardy in terms of how that might be interpreted. On the flip side, I know a scholarship program that their entire core of volunteers drive students to and from their college campus. Like that's a whole component of what they do. And believe me, they have insurance and they have rules about how they do that. They see it actually as a benefit to the student. So the student doesn't have to buy a plane ticket or a train ticket or a bus ticket. And it's really a part of their whole volunteering package, is to help those students feel supported when they go to campus. Lastly here, something to consider is if you do have or don't have a social media policy between board members, donors, and the scholarship recipients. What could start off seeming pretty harmless, you're liking something or friending a student, can kind of go sour if that student interprets that attention from you as too much attention, or if you're looking up students like when they're in college and kind of like cyber stalking them, that could create again, or it could question boundaries about the role of a board member or volunteer with quote unquote a beneficiary, meaning someone you gave a scholarship to. So Susan's saying they do have interaction via text, mail, and email. And scholarship recipients, you have not had scholarship recipients attend your functions. So interesting how people just, everyone kind of has a different way. So I'm going to stop here and ask for discussion. Please help your fellow state organizations. Pop things in the chat with, do you have rules about these things? Do you not have rules?
I like what Kathy said. In Pennsylvania, they only use LinkedIn to follow their students. So that's an interesting idea, Kathy. So they're not following them on other social media platforms. And I want to ask him, the code of conduct that you're working on, does it cover these issues? Does it
It's not written yet. And if Vicky's on the call, maybe she can speak a little bit more.
She is not.
Okay, so we provided, the members of the committee, we all kind of exchanged versions of this. So I can't speak to what's in there yet or not, because I haven't seen the draft. We just provided examples from other organizations like Volunteer America, some university websites for their own professors and staff when working with college students. And what's interesting, what's hard about this, but also interesting, is culturally too, what people think is cool in New York might not be what someone in South Carolina thinks is appropriate or inappropriate. And it's really not only about protecting your students, it's about protecting yourself as an entity. Worst case scenario, you get sued or something. Nobody wants that to happen. And I know that some people also think like, well, this is overkill. This is never going to happen. We don't have to have this. And it's like, you say that until it happens to you, or until like a rogue board member starts reaching out to a student and you have no control over that. And it can get kind of sticky. So that's why I like the idea of following the other examples that are out there. And because, your primary stakeholder audience there is college students. That's why, I kind of like the idea of following what the colleges are doing, because they have expensive lawyers. They've figured all this out already, right? They're an extremely, extremely risk-averse group. And so the other thing that's not even on here is, it's not student interaction, but it's student, like anti-discrimination. Like, you wouldn't want to discriminate against a student who maybe has a gender identity that one of your board members isn't comfortable with or something. Like, those colleges have all kinds of rules about anti-discrimination, safe spaces. So it's definitely a reality among college students. Yeah,
and I think that it's important for organizations who may not have considered getting directors and officers insurance to do so. That is what comes to my mind during this conversation, is to make sure that you're your board members are protected, because if you have a lawsuit against the organization, as board members, you can be held personally responsible for the actions of somebody else involved with your organization. So if you don't have D&O insurance, now would be a good time to get it and to become familiar with, what is acceptable and what's not. So I think this code of conduct is going to be really useful to people, Kim.
Yeah, and I saw your note too, Doug. So I think during the holidays, that committee's kind of taking a break. We're trying to reschedule and we'll pick up again. But I think sometime in early 2022 is when these would be ready. And again, they would be examples from which you can work. And like I used the words before, adopt or adapt as needed for your community, your context, kind of like plugging the holes of whatever you don't have. Okay. Okay, so we asked this question last year, and I didn't think it would be in a slide again this year, but it is. So the source credit here is from Brandeis University. And this is something we ask of all scholarship providers, again, is how are you responding during the pandemic? Being sticklers about eligibility or being sticklers, again, about the selection process. I would say if ever there was a time for a nonprofit organization to exercise flexibility and exercise discretion to help a student, it would be now. Students are facing, just massive mental health issues. It's not at any one campus, not any one type of student, it's across the board. During times like this, students are known to also have weakened immune systems. There could be increases in substance abuse, even if it's not with the student themselves. The substance abuse could be occurring in people around them, and trouble concentrating and possibly lower grades. Not all students are, when everything was online, not all students excelled in that type of learning environment. So what can you do? We often recommend, just expect a lag in responding to your timelines or deadlines, or just be gracious. If it's not actually expected, just be gracious about that. Food, housing, income insecurity, all of these things are playing out in families in different ways. And again, if students are in college or they're working or their parents can't work, they might be working and sending money home. There's all kinds of scenarios here that we've witnessed. So what can you do? Offer mini grants, care packages. I just saw someone's post on LinkedIn about a care package that they got that was great. Gift cards for extra expenses or groceries. And again, this just has to do with all of the uncertainty, but also the related stress of, the universities are trying to be flexible, but, many of them still have their deadlines or a deposit is due if you want housing, and the stress that goes along with that for the students is really palpable. And so if you, again, can be, as a private scholarship provider, you're not a government entity, and we would consider it a best practice for you to be flexible, because there's other places that can't actually be as flexible. And then lastly, a gap year or semester. So we do recommend allowing what's called deferment if your policies are flexible enough. I know some organizations operate on an annual spend policy. In other words, you have to spend the money because it was budgeted in that fiscal year, and the money has to go out the door, if not to that student, to another student. Whereas others will actually hold the funds. So if you do award a student, and for whatever reason, they can't start in that semester they thought they could, you can just hold the money for them for up to a semester or a year. And I know my own daughter took a whole year off She just found it ridiculous to be paying thousands and thousands of dollars, as she said, to teach herself, basically, because everything moved online and it just wasn't the same. So, so yeah, again, just like, what can you do? And I like to also think of Kids Chance, and I've witnessed this as just sort of like this community of encouragement. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be money. It can just be checking in with students. Again, that, you know, not crossing any boundaries, but just letting them know you're cheering them on and hope that they finish their degree. So if we look at all of this combined in terms of best practices, one of the biggest best practices in the scholarship world is consistent, predictable awards. So if you combine the children of injured or deceased workers and all the stress involved in that with going to college during a pandemic, when your employment situation, you know, could vary greatly throughout the year, just that predictability can help reduce stress, the financial stress, but also just that mental stress of students knowing that they can count on Kids Chance. Best practice is responding to the needs of vulnerable students. So already your students are different than the average student. If they've gone through or witnessed the, you know, injury or death of a parent. Best practices are scholarships that cover anything in cost of attendance instead of limiting it just to tuition, especially because now some states for lowest income students, they actually have free tuition. And so if you limit your scholarship to tuition, that's not helping the student. And then again, reducing or avoiding risky situations. And perhaps when the code of conduct comes out, really taking a look at that with your board or a subcommittee in terms of how you agree to carry yourselves as volunteers and scholarship providers. So I'm going to pause here. Barbara or Amber, if you can, I'm totally immersed and I don't have a clock. So if you can let me know.
Yeah, we've got a couple minutes here. We can take any more questions that people might have. So it's 3:45. So are there any other questions? You want to type into the chat box if you have any questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Susan said this was helpful. So thank you, Kim. I think it was helpful. I'm kind of wondering why FAFSA didn't make all these great changes when my son was in college. Like they waited until I was all done with the nightmare of FAFSA. Have any other states seen a decline in applications this past year? Do we know that, Kim?
So it's counterintuitive, right? You think like people need more money, and I have read in the chat board in the National Scholarship Providers Association that yes, some scholarship providers are experiencing a drop in applications. There could be a variety of reasons for that. Conjecture would say, well, if fewer students are going to college, then fewer students are applying. I think if you think about it, I mean, applying for a scholarship is an extra step, right? That's like one more thing that a student has to do when they're going to college, in addition to filling out the FAFSA, if they even fill that out. So there's just, I would say, I wouldn't call it a trend, but I would definitely say other providers are noticing that.
And again, as you said, some kids are taking some time off. So yeah, that may be part of it. 13 fewer awardees this year. Wow, that's quite a few. That's Pennsylvania. Yeah. So, yep.
So this is, again, you know, in wrapping up, the questions I would ask is what small changes can you implement to ease the process for applicants, recipients, or even your own volunteers? What changes require governance decisions versus just operational kind of decisions? And then proactively reaching out to students during the pandemic, or if there are additional disruptions. I mean, here I live in Wisconsin, and we just had a person drive his SUV through a parade and kill 8 people. Imagine those high school students and what they're going through, the people that were affected by, I mean, it's like, those are, again, to me, those are the exact kind of situations where what I call helping organizations, which is what Kids Chance is, should really, I don't want to say like abandon the rules, but be flexible in helping students when these kinds of disruptions or tragedies happen, or even weather tragedies. Or, you know, I remember the year Hurricane Katrina hit. I worked at a university at the time. I mean, we're taking in kids who literally have the clothes on their back. That's it. And so to require them to jump through all these hoops to get the help that they need just didn't seem fair. So I know that we, our department and the university, did like whatever we could to help those students. So what's next? You'll be getting a survey in the next few days. Barbara or Amber, I don't know how people access the recording. Do you?
Yeah, so Amber will get the recording up on the YouTube channel, and you'll get a survey in the next few days. So you can share the webinar recording. And I think I've actually learned so much, Kim. I think perhaps we'll work on trying to share some of this information out through an email to scholarship coordinators and others, because there's some important things going on there. So that's how you'll get the webinar recording if you want to share it. And remember that Kim has done a whole beautiful scholarship guide for us with lots and lots of information, and that's up on the state resource section. Mm-hmm. We're just in the middle of revising the website a little bit, and there's we're going to have a scholarship and student engagement section. The student engagement materials that the CSO developed last year will be up there. So there'll be some new materials there for you as well. We do have all of our Give Back Better webinars scheduled now through June. So next month is golfing for dollars and a lot of golf tournaments. So that should be fun. And boy, did I have fun writing that description and using all those golf terms in my description. And then the next slide, Kim, is just I think there are, those are the other 4 webinars that we'll be doing. So get those on your calendar. And I think that's all we have. Kim, thank you so much for all that you do for us and for keeping us, you know, appropriate and doing the right thing and helping protect us from risk and guiding us. So we really appreciate all that you do. And thanks to all of you who participated and all that you guys are doing to support kids. So
thank you.
Have a wonderful holiday, everyone.